Imagine for a second that you are Ramses the Great. You spent your entire life building monuments so massive they make the clouds look small. You declared yourself a living god and you were absolutely certain you'd be immortal. Fast forward 3,000 years, and you find yourself in a wooden box, headed to Paris for a restoration job. But there's a problem. French law doesn't care if you're the son of Ra. It only cares if you have valid ID. So, the Egyptian government had to issue you a modern passport. Under occupation, they typed King Deceased. That is Egypt in a single frame. The civilization that invented the concept of eternity reduced to filing paperwork for a dead man just to clear customs. This is the central tragedy of the Nile, a land that created the world's most prestigious legacy brand, only to spend the last 2 millennia being treated like a museum, exhibit, or a luxury rental property by every empire with a decent navy. Egypt isn't the gift of the Nile. It's a 5,000-year-old high-stakes psychological thriller about a people trapped in a 10-mile-wide green hallway surrounded by an ocean of lethal sand, who have spent history reinventing their souls every time a new conqueror walked through the door. To understand why Egypt is currently throwing billions of dollars into a new administrative capital in the middle of a literal wasteland, desperate startup move to escape the 24/7. Mosh pit of Cairo, you have to understand the golden chain. Look at the map. Egypt is an ultimatum. Before the first pharaoh ever wore a crown, the Sahara was a lush savanna. But when the rains failed, the prehistoric tribes were squeezed into a narrow bottleneck of silt. This was the birth of the world's first totalizing app. In most of the world, if you don't like the government, you move to the next valley. In Egypt, if you leave the service area of the river, you're a piece of jerky within 48 hours. This created a culture of unblinking submission to central authority. Geography didn't just shape their economy. It created the world's first captive audience. The pyramids weren't just tombs. They were unskippable ads for the state's absolute power. They were the original flex, designed to show the world that the pharaoh had so much excess labor and so many calories that he could literally move a mountain just because he felt like it. But here is the disruption that the textbooks usually ignore. Even the most stable unicorn startup has a system crash. Around 2180 BCE, the Nile decided to cancel its subscription. The floods failed for decades, and the pharaoh, the man who claimed his job description was making the sun rise and the water flow, was revealed to be a total fraud. It was a PR nightmare of biblical proportions. The old kingdom didn't just end. It uninstalled itself. Imagine the psychological horror of a society built on the promise of divine order, suddenly watching the river turn into a stagnant puddle while the social fabric burned. This was Egypt's first system reboot, a century of warlords and anarchy where the eternal state vanished overnight. When the Middle Kingdom finally rebooted, they were jaded. They weren't the optimistic pyramid builders anymore. They were paranoid founders who started building massive forts in the south, realizing for the first time that the desert was not a wall, but a gate. And they were right. Around 1650 BCE, the Hyksos showed up, the ancient world's version of disruptive tech, bringing chariots and composite bows to a country that was basically still fighting with glorified sticks. The new kingdom was Egypt's action. Movie Imperial phase. This is when characters like Ramses the Great decided that the only way to protect the brand was to conquer everyone else. Egypt became a superpower, pushing the frontier all the way to Syria. But being a superpower is a high burn rate business. By 1000 BCE, the maintenance costs of the empire were through the roof, and the priesthood had become a shadow board of directors owning a third of the country. As the Bronze Age collapsed, Egypt found itself in a hostile takeover situation. The country was so productive and so easily governed from a single center that it became the ultimate prize for any conqueror who could seize the capital. For the next 2,500 years, Egypt's history reads like a who's who of people who wanted a Mediterranean vacation home at someone else's expense. First the Libyans, then the Nubians, then the Persians, each one treating the eternal river like a personal ATM. Then came the ultimate vulture capitalist, Alexander the Great. When Alexander took Egypt from the Persians in 332 BCE, he gentrified it. He founded Alexandria, a city that was technically in Egypt, but felt like a Greek tech hub. For the next 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty, a bunch of Greeks who didn't even bother to learn the local language until Cleopatra, ran the country like a private grain plantation. They wore the pharaoh crowns and built temples to Egyptian gods, but it was all cosplay. They were foreign landlords who treated the native Egyptians like interns in their own country. The last of them, Cleopatra VII, was the ultimate strategic influencer who tried to leverage her relationship status with Rome to save the company. It was a brilliant move, but she was playing against a much bigger startup. When she died in 30 BCE, Egypt didn't just lose its queen. It was downgraded from a kingdom to a private equity asset owned personally by the Roman emperor. Under Rome, Egypt was the world's breadbasket, and the Egyptians were the underpaid staff. Rome was ghosting the Egyptian farmers, taking their grain to feed the Roman mob so they wouldn't revolt. But in the shadows of this exploitation, the Egyptians found a new workaround: Christianity. It swept through the valley like a viral update because it offered a way to have a soul that wasn't owned by the state. They stopped writing in hieroglyphs, essentially deleting the browser history of 4,000 years of paganism, and created Coptic. But even a new religion couldn't save them from the Byzantine tax collectors. By the time the Arab armies arrived in 641 CE, the Egyptians were so done with their Mediterranean masters that they basically let the Arabs in like a software patch that promised better performance. This wasn't just a change in management. It was a total system migration. Within a few centuries, the language changed to Arabic, the faith to Islam, and Cairo became the new headquarters of the Islamic world. But even with a new OS, the old geography remained. The Arab rulers still had to manage the same subscription service river. They eventually started importing slave soldiers called Mamluks to do the heavy lifting. In a move that was peak TaskRabbit gone wrong, the Mamluks realized they were the ones with the weapons and decided to fire the CEO and run the company themselves. For centuries, Egypt was ruled by a caste of Caucasian and Turkic warrior slaves who didn't even speak the language of the people they were ruling. It was a bizarre, feudal, dark comedy that only ended when Napoleon Bonaparte showed up in 1798 with a fleet of ships and a team of researchers. Napoleon didn't stay long, but he disrupted the market enough for a tobacco merchant named Muhammad Ali Pasha to seize power. Muhammad Ali was the Steve Jobs of 19th century Egypt. He looked at the country and saw a legacy brand that needed a total digital transformation. He seized all the land, turned it into a massive cotton plantation to feed the mills of Europe, and built a modern army. He was the father of modern Egypt, but he was also a brutal manager who worked the peasants to death. His obsession with modernization led to the Suez Canal, the world's most important toll booth, which was so valuable that the British eventually decided they couldn't leave it in the hands of the founders. In 1882, the British auditors arrived with warships and stayed for 70 years. This veiled protectorate was essentially a corporate merger where the Egyptians did all the work and the British took all the dividends. The series finale of the Old Egypt finally happened in 1952, when a group of free officers, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, decided it was time for an internal buyout. They kicked out the British and the king, and for the first time in 2,500 years, an actual Egyptian was in charge of the Eternal River. Nasser was a visionary CEO who wanted to break the golden chain forever. He nationalized the Suez Canal, the ultimate middle finger, to the old colonial investors, and built the Aswan High Dam. He wanted to update the firmware of the river so Egypt wouldn't be at the mercy of the floods anymore. The Aswan High Dam is the ultimate tech debt of modern Egypt. It worked. It ended the threat of famine and provided electricity, but it was like killing the mascot to save the brand. The Nile stopped being a wild, living god and became a utility. The silt that built Egypt for 5 millennia now sits at the bottom of a lake, while the country has to use chemical add-ons to keep the soil alive. This brings us back to the smog-choked streets of Cairo and that trillion-dollar ghost city in the desert. Today, Egypt is a nation of 110 million people living in a space the size of a studio apartment, trying to figure out how to navigate a world that doesn't care about their legacy status. They are building a new capital because the old one is crashing under the weight of its own history. It is a desperate gamble to break the 5,000-year-old cycle of the Nile and build an Egypt that doesn't need the water. But as you look at the shifting sands around those shiny new skyscrapers, you realize the irony. Every empire that has tried to ignore the geography of this land has eventually been swallowed by it. The story of Egypt is not a story of ancient versus modern. It is a story of a persistent, unyielding identity that survives by constantly rebranding itself to stay relevant. It is the ultimate legacy system that refuses to die. We look at the pyramids and think of eternity, but maybe the real lesson of Egypt is persistence. It's the story of a people who have been conquered by everyone from the Persians to the IMF. Yet they're still here, still drinking tea, still cracking jokes about their own government, and still waiting for the next system update. You have to admire the audacity of it. Any other civilization would have logged off 3,000 years ago. But Egypt just keeps refreshing the page. But as the desert presses in and the population grows faster than the river can flow, you have to ask, after 5,000 years of trying to master the river and the sand, have the Egyptians finally achieved independence, or have they just traded an ancient god-king for a modern bureaucratic algorithm? The pyramids still stand there, the ultimate read-only files, watching as a new generation of humans tries to build something eternal in a world that only cares about the next feature update. In Egypt, the past isn't just history. It's a vampire that refuses to stop drinking from the present. And the river? The river just keeps flowing north, indifferent to the user reviews of the people living on its banks. The only thing that truly lasts in this land is the sand. And the sand has all the time in the world to wait for the next system failure. After all, if a king can get a passport 3,000 years after he died, what's another few centuries of waiting? The next time you see a picture of the Sphinx, don't look at its face. Look at the sand burying its paws. It's not a statue of a god. It's a timer. And in Egypt, the clock has been ticking since the first drop of rain failed to fall in the Sahara. The question isn't whether Egypt will survive the next 5,000 years, but what occupation they'll have to type on their next passport to get there.